Two of the most common questions we get are, what happens if my tenant doesn't pay the rent, and how long will it take to get them out? In this video, I will break down the basic steps and what to expect. Hi, my name is Steve Schultz with Blue Fox Properties here in Tucson, Arizona. We specialize in managing rental houses, and we've been doing so since 2009. So first of all, I need to lead with a disclaimer, and my disclaimer is I am not an attorney. If you are seeking legal counsel, please contact an attorney that specializes in landlord-tenant law. The purpose of this video is to give you a basic understanding of what happens in the eviction process related to the non-payment of rent from the landlord perspective. So in other words, we're not going to cover other issues that could arise of why you might be evicting a tenant. The entire process can be found in the Arizona Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, and you can find the act by just Googling that and then download the PDF that you find. So the first thing, rent is late. So under Arizona law, rent is considered late the day after it is due. So for example, a lot of leases, rent is due on the 1st. So on the 2nd, if rent was not paid on the 1st, you can actually initiate this process. Now, one of the things you need to be aware of is if you have a grace period in your lease. So I heard different opinions from different attorneys of how to handle that. Some would say even if you have a grace period that you still initiate the process on the 2nd. So again, assuming the rent is due on the 1st per your lease. And others have said no, wait until the grace period is over to initiate the process. So talk to your attorney, decide what fits for you. The thing to consider too as it relates to that is if you are installing this as part of your monthly process, if you're sending notices to tenants during the grace period, that can lead to bad landlord-tenant relationships. And the other thing that could happen is if you get in front of a judge, if it goes to that point, the judge may not look favorably upon that if it was actually filed during that grace period. So just something to be aware of. Again, talk to your attorney to see what the best solution is for you. So the first part of the process is sending what's known as the 5-day notice to pay or quit. And that's actually a legal term. So that is the first thing. You have to send that notice. So the 5-day notice must state the amount of the rent owed, inform the tenant that the payment must be made in full within 5 calendar days, and then warn that the failure to pay will result in termination of the rental agreement. So here in the state of Arizona, there are only 2 acceptable delivery methods for legal notice per the act, and that is hand delivery or sent by certified or registered mail. Now, as a practical standpoint, most property managers and landlords will just do it by the certified or registered mail just because it's not practical to track down the tenant to serve by hand delivery. The thing you need to know about that is you have to allow 5 days for that to be received. So again, in the state of Arizona, once that is sent by certified mail, whether the tenant signs for that or not, after 5 days, it's assumed received. So that notice doesn't actually, so the day you send it doesn't count. Then they've got 5 days until it's assumed received, and then that next day is when that 5-day notice period begins. So during that period of time, the tenant can come in and pay the full rent, including any lease fees, any late fees, anything else that might be included, and then that stops the process. And then you would have to wait till next month, see if they pay, initiate the process again if that's the case. So they do have the ability to come current and stop the process. Now, the one thing you need to be wary of is if they want to make a partial payment. So let's say, for example, simple example, the rent's $1,000. And they come in and they say, man, I'll give you $500 now, and next Friday I'll give you the other $500 because that's when I get paid. Be wary of that, because unless you also have them sign what's called a partial payment agreement waiver, you accepting that, now you waived your rights to proceed with the eviction if they do not pay that other $500. So if you don't have that waiver, then you have to wait till the next month to start the entire process over again. So be wary of that. That is something that could come into play. So the next thing that's going to happen is filing the eviction. So this is where I recommend getting an attorney involved so you know everything is done correctly. Yes, you can go through that process and get guidance to do all this stuff yourself. It just doesn't make sense. Especially a lot of people think attorneys are expensive. And when you compare that versus the rent that you might lose for the vacancy if you do it wrong and have to wait months to get that non-paying tenant out, it's actually way cheaper to hire an attorney that's competent in landlord-tenant law and handle the entire process. So in the rest of our discussion here, I'm going to assume you got an attorney. That's the best solution. So what's going to happen is the attorney will file with the court and get a court date for the eviction hearing. Here in Tucson, the eviction hearings are usually relatively quick, usually 1 to 2 weeks after filing is when you're going to get a court date. And then the tenant must be served with the complaint and summons. And this is usually done by a private processor server. And so that server is going to try and serve by hand delivery, but usually they're also going to just post on the property as well, because usually the tenant won't answer the door and they can't do that personal delivery. So the next thing is going to be an actual court hearing then. So at the hearing, the landlord must prove that rent was due, unpaid, and that the proper notice was given. In these cases, the tenant usually doesn't show up because they have a lot of other problems. This is just one of them. And so usually they don't even show up, and they also know perhaps that they don't have the money and can't fix the situation. So usually they're not going to show up. If the tenant does not appear, the judge will usually issue a default judgment to the landlord. Now, if the tenant does show up, there will be typically only one question from the judge, at least again here in Tucson. And that question is going to be, did you pay the rent? And if the tenant says no, then the judge will usually issue a judgment to the landlord. If they say yes, this could lead to a trial date being set, because usually what happens in the eviction cases is they have a whole bunch of them stacked one after the other that the judge is hearing. So if there is an issue with this, they're usually going to schedule a trial date out. Usually that's 1 to 2 weeks out. And that's a whole nother process that we won't cover here, because more cases than not, it's usually going to be the tenant doesn't show up or they say, no, I didn't pay the rent. So the next thing is getting what's called the writ of restitution. And so if the judge does in fact rule in your favor and give you the judgment per possession, it's usually going to include the unpaid rent, the court costs, attorney's fees, and then just saying you have the right to recover possession of the property. Now, the judges here in Tucson are typically giving the tenant about a week to get out. And so if that week passes and the tenant still isn't out, then you're going to have to do what's called serving the writ of restitution. And this is where it's going to be the physical eviction of the tenant by the constable. So if the tenant still hasn't vacated after those 5 days, the constable will go to the property to perform the lockout. And the landlord has to be present for the lockout, or the property manager if that's the case. So here in Tucson, what happens is typically the constable will just go out. They'll give you maybe 30 minutes notice, maybe a couple hours. They're not going to say, hey, we'll be out there, you know, Friday at 3 o'clock. No, they're not going to give you that much notice. So you got to make sure that you're ready to go and the locksmith is ready to go too. So that kind of on a moment's notice, boom, you can be out at the property to change the locks. If the tenant leaves stuff in the property, that creates a whole bunch of other problems and a whole nother process. We're not going to handle that here. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens. So if there's anything you can do in advance to encourage the tenant to be out and take all their stuff with them, that's the best case scenario. But we're not going to cover that other process in this video. So then you as a landlord are left to try to recover damages, right? So the remaining rent owed, property damage, cleaning costs, any other amounts allowed by the lease. Here's the sad situation in the state of Arizona is if a tenant leaves owing you money, the odds of you getting that money are slim to none. The laws here changed a couple years back in Arizona where it made it very difficult to collect. And so a lot of collections companies even bailed out of Arizona. They won't even serve Arizona anymore because there's no way they can collect even as a collection company. So you really have two options as a landlord. You can either go straight to collections and try and collect, again, odds being very low, or you can try and get a judgment, which you're gonna spend more money for, and then you're right back to collections trying to collect. So I recommend skipping the judgment and just going right to collections, and again, knowing that the odds of you ever getting into that money back are slim to none. So what's the timeline, start to finish? So what to expect? Here in Tucson, from the day you send the 5-day notice. So again, let's assume rent's due on the 1st, late on the 2nd, boom, you send that 5-day notice right away. It's usually going to take about a month and a half to 2 months to physically have that non-paying tenant out of the property. Now, I know when you're not receiving rent, that seems like an eternity, but if it's any consolation, just know in other parts of the country, relatively speaking, that's really fast. Some parts of the country, it can be 9 months, 12 months, even longer than that. So it can be a really long time. So in Arizona, relatively speaking, it's a pretty fast process. So I hope this helps you better understand the eviction process in Arizona. If you found this video helpful, subscribe below for more landlord tips like this.